I'm really happy to be here and to be invited back to Georgetown. It's a school that I have a really close connection to, and I'm just delighted to be back here. So right now I'm a professor and vice dean at Brooklyn Law School, and I do mostly intellectual property law and also constitutional interpretation, two great tastes that don't really go great together. And this is diverse originalism. So originalism has a race and gender problem, its critics say. You know, it's an interpretive philosophy created and held by a bunch of white men that obsess over the views of dead white men. Many lawyers and law students look at originalism through this lens and say, that's not for me. Now, if you are an originalist and you've been going through historical documents, trying to figure out what necessary and proper means, or if you're worried about constraining judges' discretion, you might hear these kinds of rejections of originalism or concerns about originalism and not quite know what to do with them. You might think, hey, listen, either originalism is the correct way to interpret our Constitution or not. That's not going to change if the people who like originalism are conservative or white or male. And if you believe that, you might be inclined to ignore race and gender-based critiques of originalism. But ignoring those critiques would be a mistake. Originalism can both be the correct way to interpret the Constitution, and these concerns can still get at something that's real and important. So with this in mind, this talk will grapple a little bit more with what originalism's race and gender problem means more precisely, and also discuss what originalists can take away from grappling seriously with these concerns. To start, we should think about what people mean when they say originalism has a race and gender problem. Commentators don't necessarily frame it this way, but most concerns can generally be categorized into three types: concerns about consequences, concerns about legitimacy, and concerns about alienation. Consequences, legitimacy, and alienation. So let's unpack each of those and see what we learn from each one. First, someone could be concerned that originalism creates bad results for people with liberal and progressive values, for women, or for people of color. And critics might believe this because the people who wrote the Constitution were white men, their values then were different from our values now. And also someone might be suspicious that conservatives like originalism now, so presumably they like it because it reaches conservative results. So there's not too much for originalists to learn from this concern. Some argue the Constitution does lead to progressive results, like Larry Solom in his essay Surprising Originalism, and like the progressive originalist group, the Constitutional Accountability Center. But at the end of the day, if someone rejects originalism because they don't like its results, the only response is to appeal to higher order commitments, such as to rule of law or consistency or legitimacy, making it a preferable interpretive philosophy. But that's not the only kind of concern about consequences someone could have. For example, some people are concerned that conservatives today are consciously manipulating originalist interpretation to yield results they like. And this is really an argument about bad faith, and bad faith is everywhere right now. It's much easier to demonize your opponents than to try to understand how they came to their positions. And the unfortunate reality is that a small percentage of any movement acts in bad faith. But hopefully, if you've spent time with or listened to many originalists through these talks at Georgetown, hopefully you've concluded that most of the originalists you've met act in good faith. Again, there's little to learn about this concern except to try to stamp out bad faith when you see it. But there's a third potential concern about consequences, and this is where things start to get interesting. The third concern about consequences is that originalists will come to good faith conclusions about what the Constitution means because of unconscious biases and distortions of judgment. And that those judgment errors made by originalists will tend to be similar because the population of originalists are homogeneous. So the argument here goes, originalists tend to be white, male, conservative or libertarian or Republican, and so they'll tend to see things through the lens of their own experience and beliefs. Now, bias isn't unique to people with these qualities. All of us understand culture or context a little bit more clearly when it's one we're familiar with, or where the situation that we're imagining is similar to ones we've been in. And when we're trying to understand the larger world, it's easy to project our own way of seeing things onto others. At its most toxic, this might be the psychological phenomenon of projection, right? The liar says you're a liar. At its best, it's empathy at work, right? We think, oh, he probably meant X when he said Y, when we mean, well, I would have meant X if I said Y, so he probably did too. You know, and this can be quite good, but it can also be a little bit distorting if the person in the other position is differently situated than you are. This is always going to be the case when interpreting the past, because the people in the 1790s were in a very different position than the people now, often thinking about different problems, different circumstances. So this concern of having skewed opinions is worth taking seriously. It's a concern we can learn from. To be clear, this concern doesn't require, or taking this concern seriously, doesn't require us to believe that truth is inaccessible or that truth doesn't exist because humans are too biased. Rather, by recognizing that cognitive distortions exist, we can make ourselves better at accessing truth, better at understanding what's really going on. Duke professor Catherine Bartlett captures this idea about recognizing bias, helping us to access truth, in a particularly eloquent quote. In a law review article, she writes, "Overconfidence in our objectivity and excessive cynicism about it are both truth suppressing, although for different reasons. When we are too sure of our objectivity, we take things conveniently for granted, neglecting the obligation to try to identify and defend our assumptions and our criteria for truth, and to recognize alternative perspectives. When we're too cynical, we also neglect the obligation to look beyond our own perspectives, since we don't think objectivity exists, or we believe it exists only to maintain certain power relationships. There seems to be little reason to search for it." So, bias is tricky to combat because it's subtle, right? We're not cartoonishly aiming at our own self-interest, but we can't help to use the frameworks we have for understanding the world. You know, we may ourselves or have a friend who tends to be too trusting or too cynical. They judge the world incorrectly because they have a skewed interpretation of what's going on. That's not necessarily helping them. It's not necessarily acting in self-interest, but it is a bias. And so sometimes our biases advance our interests, sometimes they just distort reality. Professor Jack Balkin from Yale describes this in another work. He writes, "The choice of which facts are relevant and important, and how and why they are relevant and important, are shaped by our theoretical and practical commitments. Those commitments prefigure what we look for in the past, how we evaluate what we find, what we discard as peripheral or not germane, and what we do with the evidence we bring forward with us into the present." So there are plenty of places to skew our judgment about interpretation. So for example, there's several different versions of originalism. The one that maybe most quickly comes to mind but has been largely rejected is original intent originalism. You do what the founders intended. The most popular right now would probably be what's called public meaning originalism, where you try to follow the meaning of the words in the document according to what a member of the founding public would have understood them to mean. And in many cases, a public meaning originalist asks what a reasonable member of the founding public would have understood the text to mean. So we intuitively get what this idea reasonable means. If the Constitution says you can create and regulate postal roads, we might be pretty clear that a reasonable person wouldn't think that that means you could regulate scuba diving. But the intuitive idea of reasonableness can be pretty fraught in close cases. So we can see the challenge in understanding a concept like reasonableness, in particular by looking at the discussion of the reasonable person in feminist legal studies in the 1980s. So back in the 1980s, circuit courts concerned about cases of sexual harassment and domestic violence, some began asking how a reasonable woman would respond to harassment, as opposed to the reasonable man or the reasonable person. This move sparked a controversy, as some commentators noticed that when courts described the reasonable woman, they seemed to include a bunch of stereotypes about women. They were more moral than men, more sensitive than men, less interested in sex than men. And so suddenly you realize that our notions of reasonable man, reasonable person, reasonable woman aren't identical. These characters aren't empty. In our minds, these characters have qualities, whether we're conscious of them or not. And context matters, right? Maybe they should be this, maybe they should all be the same, maybe they shouldn't be the same. But the lesson from this reasonable woman discussion is that we need to recognize that when we decide who the generic reasonable person is, we're implicitly making judgments about those person's characteristics. And we might be projecting our own expectation of what people and what reasonable people are like when we ask who the reasonable person is, or what the reasonable person would do, or how the reasonable person would interpret this phrase in the Constitution. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't ask what is reasonable, but we need to show our work. What makes one interpretation reasonable and another not, particularly if there's evidence that some actual people maybe believed both interpretations in the founding era, is going to involve some interpretive work. Identify what canons of construction you're using. Articulate each move so you can better uncover when you might be projecting from your own personal experience. So in a lot of ways, this concern isn't new. Originalists are very concerned about bias in their writing and trying to strip it out. John McGinnis and Mike Rappaport have a version of originalism called Original Methods Originalism, where they have a specific rule for how to choose between competing constitutional interpretations. They call the 51-49 rule, based on how much evidence is on either side. What they're striving to do is remove discretion in order to remove bias. So this concern isn't absent from originalism, but trying really hard not to be biased is still swimming uphill to some degree. To be successful, you really have to bake the mechanism for contesting meaning into the interpretive process. And I think the best tonic for lack of objectivity is diversity. When people come from different perspectives and backgrounds, it's more likely that they'll be able to check one another and identify when each other's interpretations might be skewed by that person projecting from their own experiences and values. Diversity can help us find objective truths by giving us more starting points to triangulate meaning from. So when I make this claim, I think it's important to distinguish it from, so this claim, the idea that diversity can help facilitate correct judgments and objectivity, from a different idea, standpoint epistemology. So the notion of standpoint epistemology also emerges from feminist legal studies and is embraced today by some critical race theorists as well. And maybe a very quick, hand-wavy summary of it is that a person in a certain position is better able to speak authoritatively about the context they're in because there's certain kinds of knowing that can only be accessed or are best accessed through lived experience. So this argument is not that we should privilege certain interpreters over others. It's not standpoint epistemology. Rather, it's arguing that when we in the present are trying to understand what the Constitution meant in the past, we're more likely to be able to do that if the people posing the questions come from a variety of present-day perspectives. So this is lesson number one for originalists. It's important to foster a diverse population of originalists if we want to be accurate in understanding what originalism permits and demands. So a second major concern about originalism that often occurs alongside concerns about consequences is the concern that the Constitution isn't legitimate because because of the amount of time since ratification, or because of the parties who drafted and ratified it. So the core of this concern is that any constitution that excluded people of color and women in its formation is illegitimate. In many cases, even though this concern is framed as one about legitimacy, it is ultimately a concern about consequences. It's a worry that the Constitution is quite likely to create bad outcomes for people of color and women because there were no women and people of color among its drafters. In some other ways, this is a more particular version of the dead hand argument, the idea that people then had different values than people now, so why should we be bound by the decisions of people then? So that's legitimacy. Consequences, legitimacy, alienation. The third major concern is alienation. And in some ways, I think it's the most interesting concern because it's not always explicitly articulated when people are talking about originalism. It gets lost often in the explicit conversations in discussions about consequences, good faith, and legitimacy. But concerns about alienation are doing a lot of work in driving anti-originalist arguments and anti-originalist sentiments. Sometimes this concern is specifically about the taint from slavery, where you would argue the Constitution is just so defiled by its complicated entanglement with slavery, it can't be made acceptable by the Reconstruction amendments or substantive changes. The Constitution is just so degraded that it can't be reclaimed or reframed or justly relied upon. Other times, the concern with alienation is broader, and it tends to take two forms. One is a person can feel alienated from the past. You don't see yourself in the founding fathers, in the revolutionaries, and so it doesn't feel like your story. It doesn't feel like your Constitution. You can also feel alienated in the present. Originalism now and enthusiasm for the Constitution now feels very separate from you. Right now, the fact that originalism is considered kind of a conservative thing, a Republican thing, a white guy thing, contributes to that distance that other people feel from the Constitution generally and from originalism specifically. So here's where we get to the big lesson originalists can take from the race and gender critiques of originalism. Alienation, even when backward looking, is about how people treat each other today, or is often about how people treat each other today. What many critics of originalism are honing in on is the sense that originalists don't care about me, so why should I care about them? And that's not irrational. That's not denying a logical truth. That's someone betting that whatever the actual content of originalism is, if its practitioners don't care about my well-being, they won't correct wrong interpretations that hurt me. They won't respect me enough to listen if I think they've got it wrong. And even if there are legal ways to solve my problem, they'll hide in originalism to keep a result that disadvantages me. But alienation can be fixed, and it should be fixed. First, if originalism is going to be, successful, widespread, adopted mode of constitutional interpretation, it needs a broad range of adherents, or it won't gain the momentum necessary to really become an accepted mode of interpretation. And second, it's the right thing to do. The act of trying to remedy alienation isn't the same as twisting outcomes or changing results. It's about being more accurate and more fair and revitalizing commitment to the constitutional project. So I think there's several ways to do this, to address alienation. To some degree, and this is maybe to a limited degree, backward-looking alienation can be remedied by looking at historical works written by women and people of color in the relevant constitutional time periods. So if you're a public meaning originalist, what you care about is how the public understood the words in the Constitution in the relevant time period, the founding period, or when the amendments were being adopted. So women and people of color participate in creating language. We all participate in creating the language that we speak because usage creates the language. And so the language that these people used create public meaning, and they are evidence of public meaning. A lot of works by women and people of color, particularly in the founding era are lost. And what we do have is skewed to people who tended to be the most prominent or the most wealthy. But the act of investigating, nonetheless, has numerous beneficial effects, even though we're not going to get the full picture. First, whatever we find is broader evidence of public meaning or meanings. That only improves interpretation. Second, the act of looking says to everyone, women and people of color today, that I care about people like you and what they thought. And even if the act of looking doesn't change what we ultimately conclude about meaning, and it probably won't, because language usage often does tend to be pretty similar among geographically similar groups, right? And so a lot of these people were talking amongst each other, so they were participating and influencing each other to kind of have a particular kind of language or usage style emerge. The acts of checking will help undermine the concern that originalism is bad because those who believe in it today just don't care about what women and people of color think. And third, sometimes you might find something really cool and surprising. So when I was writing the paper, Diverse Originalism, that's the basis for this talk, the most striking particular sort of short piece of text that I found was written by Absalom Jones, who is a Black minister, the founder of the Protestant Episcopal African Church. And he wrote a petition to Congress in 1799 calling for the repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. And in the petition he writes, "In the Constitution and the Fugitive Bill, no mention is made of Black people or slaves. Therefore, if the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Congress are of any validity, we beseech that as we are men, we may be admitted to take part of the liberties and unalienable rights therein held forth, firmly believing that the extending of justice and equity to all classes would be a means of drawing down the blessings of heaven upon this land for the peace and prosperity of which and the real happiness of every member of the community we fervently pray." So Jones's petition essentially says, the Constitution doesn't actually distinguish between slaves and free people or white people and Black people. So everyone has the same rights under the Constitution. Jones's petition anticipates a more comprehensive, similar argument made by abolitionist Lysander Spooner in 1845 in a pamphlet called The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. So Spooner's pamphlet argued that the Constitution actually didn't condone slavery because every clause that appeared to regulate slavery could be interpreted to have another referent. So Spooner argued that other persons in the 3/5 clause referred to aliens, to foreigners, that the importation of persons referred to the importation of foreigners into the country, and that persons held in service or labor referred to convicts and indentured servants. So Spooner's discussion, to characterize it in present day terms, advocated for understanding the Constitution according to its original meaning, rather than according to the original intent of the authors. Spooner acknowledged that the Constitution's authors intended the 3/5 clause, the importation clause, and the service or labor clause to refer to slaves. However, he also argued that authorial intention didn't determine the meaning of the Constitution. Rather, the Constitution's meaning was the meaning which its words, interpreted by sound rules of interpretation, express. Later in an 1860 speech, Frederick Douglass echoed Spooner, reasoning, quote, "The intentions of those who framed the Constitution, be they good or bad, for slavery or against slavery, are to be respected so far and only so far as will find those intentions plainly stated in the Constitution. It was what they said that was adopted by the people, not what they were ashamed or afraid to say and really omitted to say." So for a public meaning originalist, the argument of Spooner's 1845 Unconstitutionality of Slavery struggles to overcome the apparent reality that everyone in the framing period knew that the Constitution sanctioned slavery. If everyone recognized that the 3/5 clause, the importation clause, the service or labor clause referred to slavery, then the lack of mention of slavery doesn't establish the original public meaning didn't include it. Text in context is what matters. If everyone knows what it means, that's what it means. Instead, it might be better to see Spooner's 1845 pamphlet as a rhetorical tool for 19th century abolitionists, highlighting the hypocrisy within the Constitution. Jones's 1799 petition, though, makes Spooner's argument more persuasive on the merits for two reasons. So first, Jones's language raises the question of whether it was truly universally acknowledged that constitutional rights didn't apply to slaves, right? So even if excluding slaves was the intent of the drafters, contemporary readers might have believed that the drafters' reticence to name slavery had inadvertently resulted in their writing a document that didn't have the intended legal effect. And second, Jones raises this issue only about a decade after the Constitution's passage. The fact that Jones's petition was sent to Congress suggests that he believed his interpretation constituted a reasonable legal position. Perhaps even he thought was the best interpretation of the Constitution given the interpretive conventions of the day. So the Reconstruction Amendments moot this question, right, of whether Jones and other members of the public genuinely believed the Constitution protected the rights of slaves whenever it mentioned persons or people. But Jones's legal argument illustrates how attention to the writings beyond the usual suspects has the potential to highlight the existence of genuinely held alternate interpretations of constitutional text. So to sum up, you can combat alienation from the past by looking for diverse sources of constitutional meaning. It improves accuracy, demonstrates good faith, and can teach us some genuinely interesting things. The problem of present-day alienation is more complicated, but still addressable. It's tied up with the notion that originalists, Republicans, and conservatives, like we said before, don't care about progressive people, liberal people, women, people of color, LGBTQ people, etc. So we're in an increasingly polarized society, and oftentimes we are more inclined to see people in it as good or bad. Of course, people generally aren't good or bad. People are complicated. People are good and bad. And that's where to find insight about how to lessen present-day alienation from the Constitution and from originalism. The first thing you have to do is challenge the narrative that people are heroes or villains. Two popular ways of thinking about American history on the left and on the right, respectively, are narrations of degradation and narratives of reverence and improvement, right? So some progressives might have a narrative of degradation. They might be arguing that we should cancel Thomas Jefferson, whereas some on the right almost worship the founders as saints. Neither of these narratives captures both the founders and the Constitution's triumphs and failures. And neither narrative pushes us to be our best selves and to be kind of the best America. There are different and more inclusive stories that we can tell. And that I think better than anyone, Randy Barnett in Our Republican Constitution and Jack Belkin in his book Constitutional Redemption kind of capture a different, more complex approach to the story of American history. Jack interestingly describes the story of America and its Constitution in semi-religious terms as a story of redemption. So in his book, he writes, "A narrative of redemption assumes we exist and have always existed in a fallen condition. We live in compromises with the evils of the past, and we are compromised by them. Yet over time, we seek to free ourselves from the sins and inadequacies of the past and hold ourselves ever more true to those best parts that have always been within us. We, the people, made a promise to ourselves in the past that we strive to fulfill." What's important about the redemption narrative is that it acknowledges sin and failure without concluding that the sins and failures of the founders, the amenders, etc., make us immutably degraded. Because it's the human condition to sin and fail and strive to be better. The redemption narrative thus calls us to be more devoted to the promise of the Constitution rather than to walk away from it. Closely tied to this move of rejecting the false binary of heroes and villains is the notion of separating author from text. There's probably no greater illustration of the dissonance between author and text than Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. So Thomas Jefferson lays out with excruciating clarity his belief in the inferiority of Black people in his book, The Notes on the State of Virginia. Yet it's also Jefferson who tells us that all men are created equal and have the unalienable right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So how do we understand the writing and the person? One approach is to just treat Jefferson's writings as defiled because Jefferson was so flawed. But that leaves the meaning of the text and the good of the text and the inspiration that it's given people behind. Another choice is to separate Jefferson from the text that he wrote, recognizing that people are complicated, and sometimes they even say things whose public meaning is very different from what they subjectively mean or what they subjectively think. So a great example of separating author from text is the founding era Black man James Forten's 1813 essay, Letters from a Man of Color. So Forten wrote, quote, "We hold this truth to be self-evident, that God created all men equal and is one of the most prominent features in the Declaration of Independence, and in that glorious fabric of collected wisdom, our noble Constitution. This idea embraces the Indian and the European, the savage and the saint, the Peruvian and the Laplander, the white man and the African, and whatever measures are adopted subversive of this inestimable privilege are in direct violation of the letter and the spirit of our Constitution, and become subject to the animadversion of all, particularly those who are deeply interested in the measure." Forten doesn't spit on the Declaration and the Constitution because of their compromised authors. Rather, he focuses only on the text and calls out actions as deviant that fail to live up to what he understands to be the public meaning of the document's stated values. So promoting a view like Forten's, with reference to diverse authors like Forten, buy into the redemption narrative and help render the Constitution everyone's Constitution, because it renders the public meaning more important than the founder's character. So one final lesson, and probably the most important one for addressing alienation, is that originalists have to do the hard work of breaking the association between conservatism, republicanism, and originalism, and being racist and sexist. And so if you are an originalist, a conservative, a Republican, you might feel like this is hard and unfair, because even if whatever you're saying and doing, you're lumped in with other people with similar labels, and you can't control what other people do or say. It's not fair that lots of people with very different views can be lumped together in the public mind because they all look vaguely right of center. But this is the work that has to be done. You have to do it. And it's possible, but only if originalists take great care in how they talk about public issues today. So this may sound a bit abstract, so maybe the best way to talk about this is to illustrate by analogy. So Jacob Levy wrote a pretty moving essay in the think tank, the Niskanen Center's blog a few years ago, that illustrates this exact problem in the context of economic libertarianism. So Levy writes, quote, "Think about the different ways that market liberals and libertarians talk about welfare from how they talk about other kinds of government redistribution. There's no talk of a culture of dependence among farmers, although they receive far more government aid per capita than do the urban poor. But once the imagined typical welfare recipient was a Black mother, welfare became not a matter of economic and constitutional concern, but of moral panic about parasites, fraud, and the long-term collapse of self-reliance." Levy's insight here is that even when one holds a general cross-cutting position, like government welfare is bad regardless of who receives it, much is revealed by how you choose to talk about that belief. When someone bemoans the welfare state, but focuses emotional wrath on individual Black welfare recipients rather than on predominantly white farmers, many Black Americans will hear those statements and reasonably conclude this person doesn't like Black people, rather than this person doesn't like welfare. But Levy's essay also suggests that despite historic associations, originalism doesn't need to disproportionately appeal to white Americans and to men. He writes analogously about free market politics. Quote, "Libertarian, individualist, and market liberal ideas, concepts, slogans, and advocates aren't alone in having a history that is entangled with white supremacy. Hardly any set of social ideas in American intellectual history lacks such an entanglement. This is as true as of the technocratic progressivism associated with the racist Woodrow Wilson as it is of the populist democracy associated with the racist Andrew Jackson. There's no good reason to sever democracy or progressivism from their complicated genealogies while tying federalism or freedom of association to theirs." But nonetheless, in recent decades, progressives have largely been effective at separating progressive ideas from their unseemly white supremacist history, while Republicans and capitalism are increasingly associated with racial subordination and oppression. So this change in how people view progressive ideas illustrates a vital insight. We, kind of collectively in how we speak, we choose today whether progressive, liberal, libertarian, and conservative values are associated with a racist and sexist past, in how we talk about them, and through what we emphasize and de-emphasize. We choose today whether originalism is associated with the racist and sexist values of the founding era republic by how we talk about the legitimacy of originalist methods and the consequences of originalist interpretation. So to put kind of action items on this, when you're doing research, look up what women and people of color said, particularly about the Reconstruction Amendments. There were a lot of people in that time period who wrote and spoke, who were influential figures about these amendments. If you believe in Second Amendment rights, make a point of being equally vocal about it, whether a particular gun owner is white or black. And be consistent in your views about the Commerce Clause, regardless of whether the subject matter is healthcare or homegrown marijuana. So there's one more elephant in the room that I think I'd be remiss not to address directly. And that's outside of originalism in the Constitution. It's about how the very polarized political and social climate we're in right now affects this discussion, right? So I imagine that this audience has people of a variety of viewpoints, but if you're on the conservative side, I could imagine that a lot of this talk was kind of a turnoff because you might disagree about how some of the loudest voices on the left think about race and gender and how they would solve the problems that they perceive. But it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Just because you disagree with some philosophical approaches to combating sexism and racism doesn't mean that sexism and racism don't exist or that there's nothing to work on. So to sum up, regardless of this tense political context, originalism is more accurate when it's diverse and sensitive to diverse populations. And we can make originalism more diverse by combating the feelings of alienation that many feel towards originalism today in how we talk about originalism with others. So, thank you.